I'm really happy to be introducing tonight's speaker, having been a huge fan of his work for quite some time now. I've actually been trying to interview him for about 3 years. I checked the emails today, and we have about 2 paragraphs down. So I think we just decided we'd just invite him and have him speak instead. He graduated from the Royal College of Art in London in 1999 and immediately launched his own design studio, which went by the name of Practice, and that's practice with an S, instead of a C, connotating the verb to practice instead of the noun, as in having a practice. This distinction between a preconceived notion of a career and a broader, more undefined statement about making becomes completely obvious when you look at the ever-expanding nature of what he considers to be his practice. From iconic cultural work for clients such as the Tate Modern, the V&A, Good Magazine, and the Barbican, to writing articles and essays for numerous magazines and books, to teaching all across Europe and America, to creating typefaces in his spare time, such as Courier Sans, which we use quite frequently in the design studio, to creating a book that is basically a conceptual test, a calibration test of the color, pattern, format, texture, legibility, and trimming accuracy of the print-on-demand service Lulu. And I bring that book up because it's kind of a fixture in the Walker Design Studio as we explore our own print-on-demand publishing program. So it's kind of sitting on our desks constantly. James' work has been featured in a number of design exhibitions around the world, including Forms of Inquiry at the Architecture Association and the Graphic Design in the White Cube show at the 22nd International Biennale of Graphic Design in the Czech Republic. His work has been featured in magazines such as Idea, Graphic Eye, Metropolis, and Vogue. After a stint as a teacher and a course director at the Werkplaats in Holland, he recently took over as the Director of Design, Print, and Digital Media at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And I have to admit that when I first heard that James was moving to the Midwest, I felt kind of an irrational sense of camaraderie and Midwestern pride that he would be here with us, and a very completely rational excitement and anticipation for the work that he'll do while he's here. So without further ado, James Goggin.
Thank you very much, Emmett, for such a kind introduction. And thank you also to Andrew and to everyone else here at the Walker who has been so helpful in finally getting me over here. And also to the AIGA Minnesota for having me here. Let me see if we're going to get a picture up here. I'm very pleased to finally actually visit. I say finally because I've been following the Walker Art Center, not only the output of the design department, but also just the general program, the institution itself for many, many years. I was just talking with Andrew about one of my, as an undergraduate student in London, one of my major goals upon graduation was to apply for the fellowship here at the Walker. And this was back in 96, 97 that I was already aware of what was going on here and found it extremely interesting. I ended up not applying, partly because Daniel Etok applied the year before me. Upon his graduation, he was a year above me at the Royal College of Art. And also I happened to start a fashion label with my wife right at the time when I should have put in my fellowship application. So it was never to be. But as Emmett mentioned, the fact that I've sort of come to another Midwest art institution, and for me with the goal of trying to at least aim towards something of the range and influence that the Walker Design Department has had, for me, has quite a strong meaning, I think. Let me see. I always have this as my first slide to test the color quality of the projectors. So I'm going to try and I have a tendency to digress when I'm talking, and I'm going to try and curb that tendency this evening and stay focused. But I'm probably going to talk for about an hour. First with a fairly short biography. I have a rather complicated background, so it takes a bit of time to get through. I'll then continue to a broad selection of projects from my studio from over the past 12 years, mostly work from London. I'll show some teaching and workshop projects, and then finish off with some of the new work which we are currently in progress with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. So to begin, this is a map that I asked my sister, I have two younger sisters, the youngest of my two sisters, drew this map for me specifically for a lecture many, many years ago. But this basically, in a nutshell, explains my background. I was born in Australia, and I have Australian parents, but my father worked for a Swedish multinational, and we were, from the age of 10, we were moved every 2 years to a different country, never to return to Australia, in fact. We were moved from Perth in Western Australia to Stockholm with the expectation we would come back in 2 years, and that never eventuated. And we carried on moving, if you can follow the rough line, from Perth to Stockholm in Sweden. We then moved to Copenhagen in Denmark, to a small town called Hamilton in New Zealand, then to Cardiff in Wales. I finished high school in Cardiff and decided to study in London, and meanwhile my parents carried on moving. They lived in Germany, India, Poland, other places afterwards. So around about, trying to remember now, 89, we moved to the UK. I finished high school in the early 90s, and being in Wales, I was already very excited that we were so close to London, and I love London as a city, and as soon as I had the chance, I moved there to study graphic design. First at Ravensbourne College of Design and Communication for my undergraduate, and then straight on to the Royal College of Art for my master's in graphic design. I was actually one of the last graduates in the so-called MA graphic design program. The name of the course was then changed the year after I graduated to Communication, Art and Design, which I'm still not quite sure why they renamed it like that. But so I'm one of the last graphic design graduates, which hopefully you'll see a bit of this in the work I'm going to show. But that's as a term used for the kind of work that I do, I still find that a very useful term. Aside from all the different kinds of work I do, I'm always emphatically a graphic designer, and I still feel like that's a wide enough encompassing term that describes a lot of the wide variety of activities that the profession encompasses. So upon graduation, Emmett's done a really good job of introducing all of this, making part of this redundant now, but I'll briefly explain. He explained perfectly the difference between practice and practice. In American English, you don't actually have this distinction most commonly. The distinction of practice with a C being a professional practice and practice with an S being the verb, repeating a task or activity in order to learn from it. Practice makes perfect, that kind of practice. And graduating 1999 from the Royal College of Art, I decided to start my studio straight away. I didn't really know what I was doing or how to run a studio, but I knew I just wanted to start straight away doing work in the real world. It was a fixation I had even at college. I wanted to make things that were really printed, that were really distributed, that had a real world context. It didn't seem right just to be making personal projects that didn't have any wider audience. And so I came up with a name partly because the very practical reason of, as a young student, giving yourself a name makes you seem a lot bigger than you are, with the possibility of perhaps getting jobs a bit easier than you might just introducing yourself as an unknown name. But I also kind of liked I think part of it was possibly coming from my childhood background of being heavily into music as well as design, and always having wanted to be in a band, but having moved around the world every 2 years, never having lived in one place long enough to form a band with any other peers. And I guess part of the seduction of starting a band is just coming up with a name. So coming up with a name for my studio seemed like a kind of proxy for that. But practice with an S, that's a really important distinction for me. The idea that as a designer, and this was actually a very conscious decision of mine when I graduated, that I wanted my studio to retain the spirit of being a student. The idea that as a designer, you are never really professional. You maintain a kind of constant line of research and inquiry. You're forever learning. And so for me, this seemingly ambiguous word, something that sounds professional but is actually quite amateur, that recognizes the need for growth and for continual learning and research, really seemed perfect for me, even if, in spite of it perhaps being quite a boring name and a very difficult one to have to constantly repeat over the phone when you're trying to get people to spell your email address correctly. So with the studio, starting in '99, I mostly worked with cultural institutions and organizations. largely in the field of contemporary art, designing anything from books, magazines and posters, identities and typefaces, through websites, motion graphics, to signage and wayfinding. Most frequently, these projects were in direct discussion and often collaboration with editors, writers, artists, and architects, all the different clients I had. And that was something I really appreciated. I was always trying to resist a conscious designer-client relationship. I was very much interested in learning from the client and using it as a way of expanding my knowledge. So as you'll hopefully see as I go through my work, there is no real one aesthetic or method based on this approach that I've taken, but rather many design approaches, some of which often contradict each other in philosophy. I usually aim for a context-based design rather than any formal dogma or aesthetic consistency, any kind of signature style. But I'm happy to be recognized for a signature approach. For me, that's a big difference, where the approach where perhaps the final result of any project doesn't necessarily look like it did when I popped into my head upon the first design brainstorming, but is rather a direct translation and critical appraisal of the given content and context, resulting in a much more honest outcome. So here you can see my studio in London. This was in 2009, just before I moved to Holland. I'm going to explain the move to Holland in a minute. In terms of, even though I designed a lot of identities and designs for other clients, for myself, for my own studio, it was very important for me to not have an identity. I didn't really have any official stationery or business cards. And I guess if I was ever recognized for any particular logo or image, it has usually been this one, which is actually a project I first started on my undergraduate course at Ravensbourne, simply color testing passport photo booths, taking this found board. It's actually a board from a board game, which I just found on the street in Brick Lane Market in East London. And I just started using it. At the time, these sort of print club, multiple sticker photo booths from Japan were cropping up in London. And I used one of them in Tokyo as well. And I would just carry this board with me whenever I traveled and it became a ritual just to do a color test whenever I visited a new place. And it's one of these projects that doesn't really, I mean, for me, it's still an important part of my design practice, and it's almost become autobiographical, but it's never really had any specific application. I've never used it in a poster or printed it in an edition. It's sort of, in that respect, it's a rather useless project. It doesn't have any application at all. But in terms of just discovering my own personal background and my identity through design based on all the places I've lived, it's gradually sort of attained quite a lot of meaning, just in the sense of, particularly post 9/11, I guess, where, I mean, even traditionally, the passport photo has always been the most official proof of existence for us. We have, the one thing that is dictated by certain protocols. We're not allowed to smile. We have to wear glasses in a certain way. This is what goes in our passport. This proves that we are who we say we are. And so suddenly the idea of, this was even much later on where I realized that the act of just blocking my face with a color test becomes something quite subversive. It comments on the idea of a lack of nationality or a lack of national identity, almost a lack of patriotism, perhaps. And this is a question that often arises with my background, having lived in Australia, having had an Australian passport, having lived in Britain for almost 16 years, but still always maintained a slight outsider status, at least in my own mind. I always flinch a little bit when someone describes me as a British graphic designer. It doesn't seem quite right. I always feel like a bit of a fake, because I'm not really British, and my accent is still tinged with an Australian dialect. And I've had certain official documents confirming these ambiguities or uncertainties over time, this being one of them when I had to apply for British citizenship to get a British passport after having lived in Britain for long enough. At the time, it was illegal in Australia to have two passports. If you wanted another passport, you had to give up your Australian passport. And so this very defiant, or very aggressive, rather, typographic act of dot matrix stamping through a passport, rendering one invisible in that country, I was no longer an Australian citizen anymore, seemed quite a powerful thing for me to have this document in my hand. I'm officially cancelled in Australia, but yet I wasn't quite British. So having lived in London for 16 years, in 2009, I received a very tempting invitation from a Dutch postgraduate design school called Werkplaats Typografie. A fantastic, very small, yet very influential school founded by the Dutch designer Karl Martens in the early 2000s, I believe. And I was invited to go and teach there, to sort of run my practice and also teach. And this was something that over the last possibly 3 or 4 years of my practice in London, it had been something I've been contemplating. I'd been progressively invited to teach and produce workshops more and more at different institutions. And it was something I loved, while at the same time I was gradually becoming quite worn down of running a very small studio with a few fantastic full-time assistants and the odd intern now and then. But working constantly with cultural clients, night and day, 24 hours on the weekends, gradually started to wear me down, and I was really interested to try and make a shift, and the Werkplaats invitation came just at the right time. All of which is to say that making the move in 2009, in the summer of 2009, from London to Arnhem, it's a very small town in the eastern part of Holland near the German border, I was again confronted with this questioning of my identity and nationality. I'm showing my British passport here because of my place of birth, which on the face of it seems very normal and logical. Tamworth. Tamworth is a town just outside of Birmingham in the middle of the United Kingdom, the middle of England. Apart from the fact that the Tamworth in question is actually Tamworth, New South Wales. It's a country town in Australia that happens to have the same name as the British town. When I got my British passport, they didn't think to distinguish between Tamworth, England, or Tamworth, New South Wales. And the very meticulous employees of the municipality of Arnhem picked up on this, and it didn't satisfy them that it just said Tamworth. They had to know exactly which Tamworth, and resulting in the fact that I had ended up with this fantastic certificate officially confirming that my geboorteland, my country of birth, is onbekend, unknown. So I had official confirmation that I'm from nowhere. So August 1st, 2009, I arrived at the Werkplaats, and I'm going to go through some of one of the Werkplaats projects I made with the students a bit later on. I planned to be at the Werkplaats for many years. It's a fantastic school with incredible teachers like Karl Martens, Armand Mavis, Paul Ellerman, Maxine Kopsa, some fantastic coordinators and incredible students, or participants as we preferred to call them at the Werkplaats, particularly because it was a very equal, non-hierarchical kind of school where very informal, a maximum of about 14 to 15 students across 2 years. Everyone has a key to the building. You can work on the weekends, night and day. And I love the place and plan to be there for several years. However, in the spring of 2010, I received an unexpected email from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago asking if I might be interested in the position of design director. And having been kind of thrown by that question and taking a while to respond, I came back to them explaining I'd only just moved to Holland and I wasn't necessarily looking for a job, but some of the points they were making in their email seemed very intriguing. There seemed to be quite a surprisingly enlightened view of the role of graphic design in such an institution, the idea that the graphic designer would be in equal dialogue with the directors, with the curators, with the education department. I was kind of skeptical of this sort of offer, particularly with, you'll see later on in another segment of my talk, a large section of work for Tate Modern, one of my longest standing clients. And I'd attempted several times to discuss the idea of starting up an in-house studio with the Tate. And due to, I guess, Tate being such a huge organization and me being just me, it never quite eventuated. But a lot of the time I was citing the Walker Art Center as, if we're going to do something interesting in an art institution, it has to be kind of based on the Walker Art Center model. That seemed to me to be the ideal. And the MCA preempted me, and I was all primed to make this kind of demand. If I'm going to consider coming to the MCA Chicago, it has to be at least something approaching the kind of model that the Walker does. And they had already been talking with Andrew as a way of informing them of the best way of describing the role, and preempted me with that. That really got me intrigued. So exactly 1 year later, from the time that I moved to Arnhem, I found myself somewhat reluctantly, but also excitedly moving to Chicago from Arnhem. This is the moving card I produced at a very small stencil printer in a town near Arnhem called Nijmegen, announcing our move. I realized that the Dutch motorway signage system and the American signage system both use the same font. They both use Interstate. So I guess a lot of you are familiar with Chicago. I don't need to go too much into that. I expect most of you have been there from Minneapolis. I can just point out, I don't know if do I have a laser beam on this thing? Yes, I do. That's where the MCA is. See if it works, right there. Fantastic location. I mean, as a European living in a small town in Holland, this is very seductive to be offered the chance to work right in the middle of the skyscrapers of Chicago. It's a town I've long followed through its music and literature, even visiting the city several times as a teenager. And it's a fantastic location. This is the view from the other direction, looking back out towards the lake. It's a relatively recent building, built in 1996. And one of the other main forms of seducing me to the MCA was this Sol LeWitt work you can see in the back of the sculpture garden at the museum, which is maybe one of the only Sol LeWitt pieces visible from space, I would argue. So I'm a big fan of Sol LeWitt, so this was, all of this was very tempting. So I've taken up the position. My role there is design director. I was very fortunate to have a ready-made team of fantastic designers, editors. We also have a newly hired full-time video producer. We have a web developer and a multimedia manager who controls the website and all the video content. So it's very much an exciting time to be joining the MCA. They had a new director join the museum about 3 years ago, Madeleine Grenstein, who joined MCA from SF MoMA in San Francisco. And she's been making a lot of big changes to the museum, and there's a lot of excitement and readiness for willingness to change at the moment in the museum. We also have a new chief curator, Michael Darling, who joined at the same time as me last summer. And collectively, it seems like there's a lot of scope for doing very interesting forms of publication, for design to play a certain role in other aspects of the museum, like in the education department and with curatorial as well. So it's currently, a fantastic place to be given a clean slate. I'm working on an entirely new identity for the museum, new forms of publications, both online and print on demand, and traditional catalogs. So yeah, it's very interesting. I'll finish off the lecture later on with some of the projects that we're doing right now. This is Chicago MMXI, Chicago 2011, the New Year postcard I just printed. Actually, right on New Year's Eve, I was screen printing these in the upstairs room of our house in Chicago. I managed to find an old cache of 1980s NASA infrared aerial photograph postcards of Chicago. This is the back. So I'll launch straight into some of my projects from Practise. One of the main reasons I decided as a teenager that I really wanted to become a graphic designer was the prospect of designing record covers. I presume that's probably quite a common reason for people to become graphic designers. At least in the past, I'm not necessarily sure whether that's the case anymore, with very small MP3 thumbnails in place of 12-inch vinyl records. But that was always a lure for me. I think there was a real turning point where I was heavily into music, and it dawned on me at one point that there was someone designing these sleeves for a living, and the fact that I could potentially do the same seemed kind of incredible to me. But in spite of my early wish of, imagining designing fantastic record covers, this particular cover from 2005 was actually the very first album cover I ended up designing. 6 years after starting my studio, I became heavily involved in contemporary art, which will occupy most of the projects you'll see coming up. But this particular project with the Berlin-based, or actually now Tokyo-based Scottish musician Momus, actually came through me commissioning him to write a piece for the magazine ... So he has constantly written, over the past 5 or so years, or even longer, written fantastic blogs with incredible pop culture and design and art criticism, and in my mind, often better than a lot of design journalism. So we commissioned him to write a piece for ... and through various discussions and emails, I ended up designing record covers for him. And each record cover, for me, the Momus covers are kind of the perfect example of the sort of collaborative relationship I have with my clients, where often you can't quite pinpoint who has done what. Momus is heavily involved in design discussions. We're also talking about various discursive references. This particular album, Momus was coming up with a concept of a derive-like idea of disorienteering, the idea of overwhelming the listener with a multitude of references, evoking feelings of being lost in a denser Asian city. And so a lot of my covers for Momus have been literal graphic interpretations of this. This was kind of almost like a Tokyo subway line made up of the material, various materials like lace and plastic and wires referenced in his lyrics. If you look closely, it also spells out the word Momus in the circular patterns. And we found ourselves referring, by coincidence, to various cultural figures who we both had in common that we admired, and ended up with each album that we designed, we would sort of anoint a patron saint for each album, hiding under the CD, in the CD tray. And for this particular album, it was the architectural critic and cultural theorist, the British writer Rainer Banham, who was hugely influential for both of us, not only as a writer, but also as a style icon. In this particular photo, you can kind of just make out Rainer Banham cycling past the Architectural Association in London on his small-wheeled Moulton bicycle, 1960s British classic of design. And it's the same kind of bike that I now cycle around on in Chicago now and then. The next album was, again, a mixture of references. We were talking about Bruno Munari and Milton Glaser, all kinds of different topics. At the time, Momus was obsessively blogging about the design collective Orbecker, a London-based design studio who happened to be friends of mine. They had a studio in the floor below mine in the East End of London. And so I kind of conflated all of these various references. Bruno Munari, who is probably my most favorite artist and designer, particularly for these kind of works, which cross the boundaries of product design, graphic design, typography, even toys. This is a modular alphabet from 1960, just random geometric shapes, which, when given to children, somehow beautifully, instinctively become letter forms. The children just can't help themselves into making letter forms with these shapes. So for this particular album cover, since we were mentioning Munari and all these other figures, I decided to recreate that very scene, but as if the androgynous child is now grown up 20 or 30 years later and has become Kaiser, the girl from Orbecker, from the design studio. And the lettering has been replaced, rather than Munari's modular lettering, it's Milton Glaser's baby teeth font from the 60s. The patron saint for this album cover was the Emperor of Ethiopia and Rastafari Messiah Haile Selassie. So I'll run through a few identity projects, another area that I worked not so often in, but something that I very much enjoyed and was interested in doing more of. This is another one of my perhaps longer-term collaborators in the same vein as Momus, the architect David Conn, who in 2008 moved from the influential British practice Caruso St. John and started his own practice, David Conn Architects. And again, David and I found various fascinations in common, Chinese tangram puzzles, which you just saw, which we immediately decided would form the constraint for our identity. It would have to be something that could be built out of the tangram puzzle. I had my own ideas and criticisms of architects in general, at least in London, their tendency for lowercase grey Helvetica for their identities and the resistance of actually having a conscious logo. This was something I really emphasized to David. I want to give you a proper graphic logo, something real. I mean, what we ended up with was definitely conscious, bright green, geometric shape. But at the same time as it being a definite logo, it was also a very ambiguous logo. And ambiguity is a word that I use a lot. It'll probably come up several times in this talk. Something I use a lot in my work. I like things being ambiguous, some things that can have multiple meanings, but yet still have some kind of clarity. The clarity for David's icon, or for David's logo, is simply a way of differentiating himself from other identities, other architect logos. So in that role, it forms its basic function as a logo, as something to differentiate. But at the same time, it's very ambiguous. It could potentially spell DKA for David Conn Architects. It sort of looks like a bird. The bird part of it was very conscious. One of the very first discussions about the identity, we found ourselves, rather than talking about the briefing of the project, we found ourselves talking about what we saw as perhaps being the unseen connection between birds and architecture. This is the official practice stamp of Pierre Jeanneret, who was the cousin of Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier's name itself means raven-like. And so we started to make all these bird connections with architecture history, and also much more formalist kind of connections. This is the old Finnish tourism board logo, which we both really admired. It's now defunct. So we were kind of packing a lot of these references into what is, on the face of it, a very simple, basic identity. I produced a sticker sheet as part of his stationery set, so he could use these other references now and then, not necessarily as official parts of the identity, but just as little references to stick onto envelopes or business cards. The very last project I worked on before moving from Holland to Chicago was, again, actually with David Conn. Quite an interesting signage project, quite a tough challenge where David was invited to design the actual exhibition architecture for a project about Italian culture, Italian kitchen culture, Italian table culture. The exhibition was called Tutti a tavola, everyone to the table. And it was basically celebrating Italian product design through the spirit and conviviality of the Italian kitchen, the history of families gathering around the table and eating, and the kind of products that has generated. David's part was designing this very modular architectural system, which had to work within the context of the venue, which was Villa Reale, a 19th century mansion housing the city of Milan's collection of 19th century artwork. And the challenge was particularly that all of this artwork, the 19th century artwork, had to stay in place during this temporary exhibition. And so we ended up designing very anachronistic forms of signage. The previous slide, you saw this sort of flex neon lettering, and all of the interior signage was with stencil cut vinyl placed onto light tape, very thin backlit lighting. And we made a conscious effort of emphasizing the anachronism and sort of incongruity of very modern signage against these very Baroque interiors. The 19th century artworks remained accessible to the public at the same time as showing video screens and other artifacts that related more to the exhibition. Another identity with a connection to New Zealand. As I mentioned, it was one of the places I lived growing up. My wife is also from New Zealand, so we spend quite a lot of time there each year visiting family. And I've always had quite a strong connection with the place. I lived for another 2 years there during my period in London. My eldest daughter was born in New Zealand. We lived there for 2 years, continuing to run my studio and my wife's fashion label from New Zealand during that time. But it was only in 2009 I finally received a commission for a project from New Zealand, and it was a very interesting one for the representation of New Zealand, 2 artists at the Art Biennial in Venice. And this kind of in a similar way to not necessarily a kind of collaborative or discursive method as it was with David Conn, but another approach that I tend to take with identities is to do as little as possible, just to let the various circumstances or elements at hand do the job for me. And this one was, in that sense, was particularly easy and sort of ready-made. It's, on the face of it, quite an, again, ambiguous, slightly unclear identity. It looks a little bit like a sunrise, like a Pacific sunrise, or alludes a little bit to Maori wood carving. But at the same time, it happens just to be the letters N and Z typed with the font Futura Black. If you just type N and Z next to each other, that's the logo. And so this is something I'm often trying to work with, just something so basic that you almost forget about the logo. It looks like how it should be, and you focus more on the work itself. In this case, the work of the 2 artists representing New Zealand. These were the ubiquitous and essential tote bags which everyone has to produce at Venice for various pavilions. And we were fortunate for each artist had great titles for their shows, so we simply printed the titles of the bags on the titles of the shows on each side of the bag. Save Yourself for Francis Pritchard and Giraffe Bottle Gun for Judy Miller. And this led to very nice situations in Venice when I was walking around photographing the bags in use. I was particularly pleased to see this fashion victim wearing a Save Yourself bag. Another quite similar approach to New Zealand was the identity for the Docklands Light Railways identity for the Docklands Light Railways public art program, DLR Art. And for this particular project, it was the 20th anniversary of the Docklands Light Railway, which is a rather futuristic elevated railway system, public transport system that goes through the East End of London, through some of the poorest areas of the East End, but also going to Canary Wharf, one of the richest parts of London, with all the bank headquarters situated there. And again, was trying to focus not so much on the aesthetic or the formal aspects of the logo, but rather the role that the logo had to take, which was really the context of showcasing public art in railway stations. And again, I tried to take this ready-made approach where I didn't want to really add anything extra as a graphic designer. I wanted to take the elements that were at hand, the Docklands Light Railway roundel logo, the color palette, the typography, and simply shuffle things around rather than redesign or add or design something new. So you can see just taking the circle, taking the crossbar, setting the DLR lettering to the height of the crossbar, taking the almost too obvious graphic designer step of recognizing the inherent R in both DLR and art and simply crossing them over. I was very interested in the common criticism of contemporary art of, my 5-year-old could have done that. And I kind of like the idea of the logo being held to the same criticism, just almost too obvious, crossing the DLR and the art. Even the color red, for me, was decided by the color of the DLR trains. The identity is this sort of navy and turquoise color system, but whenever you mention the DLR to anyone in London, they think of the red trains winding their way along the Thames. And so that immediately determined the color palette for me. And I took a similar approach for the signage materials themselves, using what I decided as sort of graphic design ready-mades. As you saw in the previous slide, the signage system of the Docklands Light Railway, same as the London Underground transport system, has all these stainless steel poster casings, baked enamel, colored signage, and I just simply reused those existing forms, simply changing the color and the lettering. Even the plaques announcing the artworks, which originally were requested more as kind of special gold plaques, really commemorating these fantastic new artworks, for me it was much more of an idea of putting them into the background. They had to be part of the everyday, just in the same way that the mission of DLR art was to place art in an everyday public transport context. So for me, having the plaque stainless steel set into the same kind of pavement stones that everything else is set on the sidewalk around the stations, ready to be covered with chewing gum and dirtied up, that was the proper way to announce the artwork for me. I really like the idea of the logo simply becoming another arrow, a form of signage, not pointing or drawing attention to the logo itself, but pointing to the artwork, which was most important. I'm going to run through a few typeface projects of mine. It's something that's consistent in a lot of my projects, but I would never really call myself a typeface designer necessarily. I'm more of a graphic designer who has a really strong interest in typefaces and typography. Emmett mentioned Courier Sans, and that's really, to date, the only officially commercially available typeface of mine. And it's actually one that I started while studying at Ravensbourne on my undergraduate course. Originally, it was simply a reaction to the courier-only rule that was placed on us by our teachers. We had to spend several months only using courier with photocopiers doing various strict Swiss-style typographic exercises. And in my mind, everyone's work was beginning to look the same, so I lopped off the serifs, the slabs of courier, and made this variable width version of courier just to partly get around the rules of this courier-only dictate. I kind of forgot about it, but starting to teach in Switzerland in the year 2000, I met the Swiss designer Cornel Windlin, who looked at the font and really liked it and wanted to start using it, and asked me if he could use it for the next edition of the Most Beautiful Swiss Books catalogue. And I didn't see any problem with that. I'd kind of almost forgotten about the font, but as soon as the catalogue was launched, we were immediately inundated with a huge demand for the typeface, and so it became the first officially completed, officially fully drawn typeface of mine. Something I really enjoyed, but something I've, to date, never had the full chance to do again. I make a lot of different typefaces. I'm going to show you some more examples. But I still have yet to finish another full, complete set. Not for want of trying or for a desire. I would love to do more typefaces, but I never seem to have the time. This is I'm just showing these political billboards from Switzerland as an illustration of something that I encountered once Courier Sans was released, but something I hadn't really considered before that. Something very interesting to me as a graphic designer used to controlling everything was the relinquishing of control when you release a commercially available typeface. Anyone can buy the font and use it for whatever they want, and you don't keep track of who's buying it. You don't really have reports on who's buying which typeface. And you're often walking down the street and encountering your work in a totally unexpected context, and it's something quite discomforting at times. This was the FDP, which is the Swiss Liberal Democratic Party, who ordered the font, ordered a huge license for their official identity in 2007, and it again raised this question: what happens if a political party you don't necessarily agree with buys your font and starts to use it as a form of propaganda almost? And I don't really have an answer for that, but it was something very interesting to think about. At first I was comforted. I thought the Liberal Democrats in the UK, that's one of the most left-leaning parties. Not necessarily anymore, now that they've hooked up with the Conservative Party in the UK, but it turned out that the Liberal Democrats in Switzerland are much more sort of centre-right. And so it was very interesting for me to be aware of my font being used for them all across Switzerland. I was getting phone calls from friends of mine in Switzerland complaining about how sick they were of seeing my font everywhere. And as it turned out of the major parties in Switzerland, they did the worst in the elections. So maybe Curia helped with that. This is the next typeface of mine, which is supposed to be officially released with line 2, with the same type foundry owned by Cornell Vinland, hopefully in the next 6 months or so, called Prismaset. And like Curia Sans, it's again based on a historic font. I mean, Curia, everyone thinks of it as being a very default typeface, but it's in fact consciously designed by a fantastic typeface designer called Bud Kettler, who worked for IBM, designing many typewriter typefaces. And Prismaset is based on an all-caps multi-line typeface designed in 1931 or 32 by the German typographer Rudolf Koch. The original P from his font is the top left there, the 5-line version. And it's something I very slowly started working on, and I've been working on with various colleagues and friends of mine, initially with Laurens Brunner, who is himself now a very accomplished typeface designer, also designing fonts like Accurate for line 2. We made a filled version of this font for a Gagosian catalog, and then started recognizing the inherently modular qualities, and I continued to work on it with other designers. I know Alex Rich and a Swiss designer, Raphael Koch, who happens to have the same surname as Rudolf. And Raphael continues to work with me on trying to finish this very long gestating font. We started it in 2004, and it's still ongoing. But basically, out of these 5 lines, we recognize the inherent modularity, the capacity for outlines, fills, stencil versions. And we've been slowly developing it and using it, both myself, Alex, and Rafi, on many of our own projects as we've been slowly going along. And this seems to be the main way that I'm able to design typefaces or find time, is to have applied projects specifically where I can use the typeface. So I'll end up generating just the right amount of letters for color after Klein, for example, and then later I'll try and use it for another project and realize I haven't designed a question mark yet, or other things like that. So this is generally my current rather unfortunate process for designing typefaces. Another alphabet, not necessarily a typeface, but definitely an alphabet, was this one-off commission from the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2007 on the occasion of their 150th anniversary of the V&A, where they invited 150 designers, architects, photographers, fashion designers, and artists, all to contribute a page to a large anniversary album. And I was very pleased to be asked to do this. The V&A is one of my favorite museums in the world, with a fantastic collection ranging from graphic design to craft to fashion to art. And I decided to try and illustrate the breadth of this collection as a collaboration with my then, I believe, she must have been, let me think, 6 years old, my 6-year-old daughter, where we basically made an alphabet trail around the museum for a day, trying to find various forms, shapes that resembled letters of the alphabet, resulting in this V and A to Z. So this brings me to one of the larger bodies of work which I've produced over my 12-year studio practice, which was for the avant-garde British music magazine, The Wire. Between 2005 and 2007, I was the art director, and taking over from the famed tenure of British designers Non-Format, who did an almost legendary job of, they became very well known for their decorative headings and headlines for The Wire. And so it was kind of a tall order for me to take over and try and make a shift in a different direction. if only a very reactionary shift, just to do something to contrast against the intricacy of the designs produced by non-format. But it was a fantastic honor to be asked. The Wire was a magazine I've been reading for many years. And it was a very difficult project. I only had 1 week each month. The rest of the 3 weeks, I was still running my studio, working for museums and galleries, designing books and publications. And so I would just leave my studio for 1 week, go into the Wire's office, listen to a lot of loud music, and produce a 120-page issue with myself and an assistant. As art director, I'm just going to run through some of the covers as I talk. As art director, my role covered the typesetting of each issue, the commissioning of all photography, the management of the shoots. I would have to coordinate with the musicians, with the photographers. A lot of the time, the shoots would be in, most of the time, they would not be in the UK. So during the other 3 weeks when I was back in my studio, I would suddenly get a call, we need to shoot PJ Harvey in Dorset, or someone else in Berlin tomorrow. They're only available tomorrow. I'd have to scramble and find a photographer, think of a location, art direct it. So very exciting job, but also very challenging and very time-consuming. I would also do all the color correction for each issue, all the pre-press. It was quite a heavy load, but a fantastic opportunity to be listening to all the music that the magazine journalists were writing about and to read each issue in advance. Just run through a few more covers here. My reaction to non-format's approach was to really strip it back, and almost the opposite of my reaction I had to the courier-only rule in my design school project, where I was rebelling and trying to make another typeface. I actually set myself the very constraint that I'd been fighting against at school by enforcing a univer-only rule. So the entire run of issues that I designed were solely set in the typeface univer. Every now and then we would not have a photographic cover, but have more of a themed cover where I would have the opportunity to illustrate the cover for the magazine. And so here, for example, we had a Seismic Performances, 60 Concerts That Shook the World issue, where I had these kind of earthquake patterned stage lights, or the annual end-of-year rewind issue where the Wire would look back over their criticisms from the past 12 months and create a sort of top 50 albums of the year. The Wire is known for being extremely critical, almost too critical of lots of different kinds of music. They cross all genres. They write about anything from dubstep to hip hop to improvised jazz to minimalist composition. But they're also extremely critical of a lot of music, and it's very rare that you get a fairly mainstream artist onto the cover. And so the concept for this particular rewind issue was that the Wire would be so critical that they would even shred the last 12 months of issues in starting the new year. Just quickly skip through some of the other covers. Another challenge we had with commissioning photography for the Wire was how common the very banality of the PR junkets and the periods of time allowed for journalists and photographers to access particular musicians. Cool Keith was a perfect example where the situation was just one morning in a New York hotel room, 5 or 10 magazines each had a very short time slot to photograph Cool Keith and interview him in promotion of his latest album. And you just knew that in a month or so's time, there'd be lots of magazines going out with all of the same photograph of the musician. So we took various approaches. This particular one, we decided to accentuate the banality of the hotel room by photographing this notorious rapper simply filling a glass of water from the water machine or hiding behind the curtains. For Sonic Youth, we took the opposite approach of accentuating, rather than accentuating, of subverting the banality by commissioning the Swiss photography collective Kerner Union, who decided to take a huge roll of black velvet to Paris for the hotel shoot. The hotel room was a classic gaudy sort of fake Louis XIV interior, and Kerner Union simply taped up. You can see the sort of tape marks that taped up even on top of the painting in the room, the black velvet, thereby creating a void in which Sonic Youth was kind of rolling around and falling over. Another side project for The Wire, which again was very enjoyable, was the Wire Tapper covers. Every 6 months, The Wire would release a compilation of the music that they've been writing about for the past 6 months. And I took this as an opportunity to commission artist patterns. I would just commission a different artist to make a pattern for each cover. Nothing almost avoiding relating to the music at all, but simply abstract shapes to differentiate one tapper from the other. I'm going to run through a few publications. This particular one crossed over a little bit with The Wire. So it was for an arts organization in London called Electra, who are involved with projects spanning sound art, moving image, music, and visual arts. And this was a catalogue for a project, an exhibition called Sound Escapes, which was pairing contemporary artists with acousticians, engineers, and social scientists dealing with works to do with sound in urban spaces. So we kind of had this spectrogram motif, this hexagon, which is an official form of measuring, kind of graphic representation of measuring sound frequency by amplitude over time. And this was a very humble catalogue. A lot of the work I did in the arts sector in London was very much constrained by budget. They always had very low budgets. And for me, it was, rather than seeing it as any form of compromise, it was actually a constraint that I embraced as a graphic designer and really loved to try and find ways of seemingly exceeding the value of what was actually quite a paltry budget. So this was actually a very simple saddle-stitched document, but somehow ascended the very basic quality of cheap recycled paper and only certain sections being printed in color. On the opposite end of the scale, I also worked with much larger publishers like Fiden, where you would have a seemingly infinite budget and the ability to test certain things like foil blocking the four edges of a book, as in this particular example, where for the sculpture and installation survey, Vitamin 3D, I decided to make a consciously three-dimensional book, a book that was self-aware of its own dimensionality to the point where it started to resemble a Lego brick. Other kinds of publications I regularly worked on in London were often smaller scale, often directly in collaboration with the artist, with smaller galleries like Tate Modern. This particular project, Francis Superchard, who was the artist representing New Zealand in Venice, was someone I worked with in quite a few publications. Again, in collaborating not only in design direction, but also in editing. It was often I was fortunate to be left to edit the book directly with the artist, with very understanding gallerists. Similar project for the same gallery with a half Japanese, half British painter, Peter MacDonald, where we designed an English language front cover, simply cataloguing almost encyclopedia style the various topics of Peter's paintings in the book: teaching, airport, hair salon, bakeries, and snooker. And then with a Japanese back cover, where we decided to play with the idea of translation and giving the Japanese title something slightly different. The Japanese title was hair salon, bakery, airport, and we put ninja in there as well, just for fun. Another project, again, with one of my longer-standing clients, Bookworks, a fantastic small artist book publisher based in London. This was a great project with the British artist Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane, who for many years have been collecting and building up a huge archive of contemporary popular or folk art. And it was the first attempt since the Festival of Britain in the 50s to document popular and folk art of the present day. So rather than being a book about contemporary art, it was an artist book that happened to be documenting what Jeremy and Alan saw as real art, the kind of art that the everyday person does. Here you can see a Welsh Mary Lwyd, which is a kind of horse-like figure. It's a kind of luck-bringing ritual in Wales where participants accompany a person disguised as a horse running around various houses and pubs singing in order to get food and drink, in anticipating spring. So it was all of this kind of stuff featured in the book. Jeremy himself had this fantastic phrase, which probably sums up the approach of the book best, where he said that if pop art is about liking things, as Andy Warhol said, then folk art is about loving things. Another project for Bookworks was, again, a very direct collaboration with the British artist Alison Turnbull, a color translation of the Japanese novel Spring Snow by the Japanese writer Yukio Mishima. This was one of several Bookworks projects I worked on, and they were one of the first organizations I went to show my work to upon graduation from the RCA. And I was just very lucky. I didn't receive work from them straight away, but they remembered me, an obsession with color and an obsession with Japan that I had mentioned in one of my meetings, and 2 years later, they came back to me with this perfect book, which was literally just color translation, translating all of the texts of the book into color. And that brings me neatly on to color testing, the Dear Lulu project, which Emmett mentioned, which I'm very pleased to hear is actually being used here at the Walker Art Center. This actually came out of a very small workshop, just planned for 2 days, and without a clear idea of what the outcome would be, at the Hochschule Darmstadt, a small design school as part of the University of Darmstadt in Germany. And my original brief for the students was the week before was to collect as many color calibration, color tests, color charts as possible. And this was the first morning of the workshop. We spread them all out on the table and started to appraise this very practical side of graphic design, the very empirical sector of design, which is all about the graphic design's control of seemingly intangible, the intangible nature of color, the uncontrollable nature of print, and how do we as graphic designers attempt to kind of constrain this process. So the very basic mission was a test book for print-on-demand systems. I'd personally first come across print-on-demand through Dear Lulu when teaching at Rhode Island School of Design. I was surprised at the number of very professional-looking publications the students were producing, and wondered how on earth they had made these perfect, glossy, perfect bound catalogs that they were showing me. And they kept talking about someone called Lulu, and I was really curious. Who's this Lulu? How are they printing these books for you? I discovered Lulu.com, the idea that I presume you're all familiar with it, but if not, Lulu.com is one of several print-on-demand services online where you can simply upload a PDF, offer the book for sale, and even for yourself to get a copy, you simply order one copy, and then it's printed on demand. It's printed as you order. Really, as a way of, at least for graphic design in the last 5 years, it's become a very useful way of subverting the expectation of economies of scale, where you must print quantities of thousands in order to make a book. You can now print one if you want, and there's no leftover. You don't have to store excess copies. You don't have to pulp unused copies. You can just print them as you need them. It was something I was very interested in, and as a graphic designer, I had immediate questions. Do you need to print with RGB or CMYK? What's the quality like? How do photographs come out? What sort of point size can you go down to? And after having I had a plan to make my own test book, and having not found the time to do it, I decided the students would be the perfect people to do that job for me. So we decided quickly split into groups on the first day and divided up into people who would document color, people who would design moire patterns, people who would test lines and other forms of graphic design which could be tested. And it was decided late in the afternoon that on the second day we should all dress as a color. And so that explains this picture, which you've been seeing on the Walker Art Center poster for these Insights talks. But dressing as a color, not only creating a very festive atmosphere for the day and very productive, it also served as perfect color test material for our publication. So we had sort of rainbow colors here, CMYK. We are also testing CMYK versus Adobe RGB and Screen RGB, half-toning, grayscale. The brief that I had written for the students became the typeface testing in various point sizes. Some of the other students worked with lines, with moire patterns, skin tone. 2 students disappeared for the 2 days and came back with this incredible encyclopedia of color from the local environment. They made an entire rainbow color spectrum of car exteriors, curtains, clothing, anything they could find in the street. And as it turned out, I was very lucky I'd asked the students to work on this project because they even thought of things that I hadn't considered myself when I was first planning my own test publication. And a very important part of it, the finishing process, how well does Lulu cut the books to size? So we placed millimeter measures from the top of the page, created kind of InDesign style cross-frame outlines, and you could very quickly see upon receiving books back how badly they cut them several millimeters off most of the time. So the result, this was really just 2 days' work. We had a deadline of 5 o'clock on the second day, where I had to head to the airport. We had to upload the PDF or fail. So we uploaded the PDF to lulu.com and also to a German print-on-demand company, BOD, Books on Demand. And again, this was the title of the book and the text on the cover came out of a very honest and direct question from one of the students, just wondering aloud whether anyone at these print services actually reads the books or reads the covers. So we decided that would be the perfect cover to write a very humble letter to the people at BOD or to the people at Blurb to please try and print these line, color, pattern, format, texture, and typography tests for us. And it's had a very nice life, this project. People have found it useful. We made what we saw as very conscious design decisions, like applying a Creative Commons license to the publication so other people could download a freely available PDF. We set the cost of the PDF download for free so people could download it and test their own printer if they wanted or their own online services in their various countries. And I've also increasingly started receiving invitations from other print-on-demand companies. This is Colophon in Oslo, who I made a version for their print-on-demand system. And I'm working on one for Publit, a new Swedish print-on-demand service right now. But at the same time, it has been a very useful tool for myself and for others just to determine what kind of color quality you get and how things turn out when you mysteriously send off these PDFs and receive these packages back in the post. But I've had certain examples which have almost underlined the entire futility of the whole project. This particular case, these were 2 editions ordered at the same time from lulu.com, and both arrived back with different tints of cyan or magenta on the back covers, thereby rendering, if you happen to only receive one of these and use that as your control test, your entire color calibration would have gone out the window. I'll very quickly run through, there were many projects I worked on with students at the Werkplaats, but this, to me, seems to sum up a lot of the spirit and the kind of work we did at the Werkplaats. And this was a very fortunate invitation from A.A. Bronson, who had been invited to the Werkplaats by the graduating students of 2009 to give a talk. And there was a real interest during that year in general idea and the work of A.A. Bronson and his activities with the New York bookstore Printed Matter. And he was invited to the school, he loved the place, and very kindly invited the Werkplaats to come en masse, the entire school, to occupy a project room during the New York Art Book Fair in 2009. And this invitation was extended again this last year after I had moved to Chicago, so I was able to meet up with my students once again in New York during the book fair in 2010. But the way the Werkplaats works is what I think is very unique. I mean, it really started as a literal Werkplaats, as a workshop, almost like a direct apprenticeship with Karel Martens, with the legendary Dutch graphic designer who founded the school. And the early years was really just a few students working together with Karel in the school building as his studio, working on commissions with him and learning from that. And that spirit is carried on. It now has master's accreditation. They have theory courses and they read and write, and as well as doing graphic design. But this kind of dual role as studio and academic institution remains. The Werkplaats is commissioned regularly as a graphic design studio with real projects. And part of my role there fell into the camp of being almost like a studio manager, managing 15 or 16 students at the same time as teaching them in other projects and acting as a tutor. Anyway, the project room, we turned it into almost 2 parts. One part was the recognition that it is a book fair, we have to sell books. And there was great interest in the regular output of self-published publications that the Werkplaats is known for. And we decided on one level just to have a gallery wall, an exhibition of the work, which was all available to sale. So it was half exhibition, half bookshop. Visitors could pull down a work that they wanted to buy that would leave a whole kind of space in the wall, which the students would have to scramble and rapidly curate a new work into that empty space. But there's always a spirit of subversion at play at the Werkplaats, and so we decided on the other side of the room we would be bootlegging the very books we were trying to sell on one side to visitors. So visitors who didn't want to buy a book but wanted perhaps just one essay from one book could, on the table you can kind of see over there on the left, they could pick up that book, find the section they wanted to copy, take it to one of our students. We hired a photocopier for the week, and the students would photocopy various selections, as many as you wanted, bind them together with a wire binder, and sell them to you for $5. And we made 2 copies of each of these publications. Each one was stamped with an editor and producer. The editor was the visitor, The producer was the student, the printer and binder was the student. Essentially, the graphic designer becoming this, really a service of just printing and binding. But we consciously made 2 copies, one obviously for the visitor, for the editor, and one for our own library as a way of building a collection of almost remixed, bootlegged versions of our own publications. And it was very interesting to see which particular articles or texts or works had resonance with particular visitors, and each version was kind of a mini anthology created by someone often total strangers to the school. So a very nice way of kind of objectively and critically looking at ourselves. These are some of the staff and students. We were very lucky to have Experimental Jet Set design our uniform for the week. New and Werk and York and Platz, riffing off their already very riffed off Beatles t-shirts. And at the same time, I guess a third component, aside from the bookshop and the bootlegging, was the recognition that we are a school. And we set up a series of lectures during the weekend where, very aware of the New York Art Center, the New York Book Fair being a center of incredible artists and designers and publishers during that week. A lot of people we admired were there, and we pretty much ahead of time, but fairly close to the time, cold called them, and certain people we admired asked them would they like to come and give a lecture in our space during our occupation of our school occupation of the project room. And we were fortunate to have people like, in this picture, Thomas Lawson, the publisher and editor of seminal New York magazine, Real Life, which several of the students had a particular obsession with at that time. And he actually just agreed to come down and give a talk about the history of real life to us, which was incredible. So I'm already at an hour, so I'm going to, almost at the end of the talk, but I'm going to run through 2 different projects which highlight my 2 main bodies of work, my 2 main clients during my 10 to 12 year career in London. The first being Camden Art Centre, and it's a very, very basic project which I can describe fairly quickly. A small series of publications called File Notes, which I started in collaboration with the Belgian graphic designer Sarah de Bont in 2004. Sarah and I shared a studio for many years, sort of working together, but also running our independent practices. Sarah actually first moved to London to work for Daniel Eatock as part of his Foundation 33 studio, so there was a connection there. But we were approached by Camden with a fairly typical request from London art institutions. They have regular exhibitions, but not the budget to produce lavish catalogs for every single show. And they wanted some kind of affordable, humble publication that would still be collectible and desirable in a certain way. And it was one of these projects where the very first, most obvious idea that popped into our heads seemed the perfect thing to go with, and which was really just to make them collectible by almost forcing the reader to have to collect them by tabbing them. The minute you put tabs in numbering each file note, you can't possibly miss one because there'll be a gaping hole in your collection. So this is something we've been doing since 2004. We've designed over 70 of them now. They're very humble, 8-page, sometimes on rare occasions 12-page, often printed in batches of 3. And in doing this, we're always conscious of balancing the budgets. I mean, this example, we decided to print on recycled stock with one color, which enabled us to have a 5th fluorescent green Pantone for one of the other ones being produced. We're always kind of doing this slight balancing. Very set template, just a Helix New, which is a stencil-based typeface of mine, also incomplete. I had to quickly design an E with umlaut for Renee Daniels, for example, when we were typesetting this one. The idea is very consistent system, the tabs, the loop staples, which enable you to bind them into a binder, yet still turn the pages to read them like a book. But at the same time, very consciously wanting to make each publication feel totally different from the other, changing the margins, changing the paper stocks, changing the various CMYK, one color, Pantone colors. And we also added certain other consistent elements that were at the same time a way of making things change and improvised each time. The backs being a good example here. One of the main requirements of the back of each file note was to display the Camden Art Centre official logo. they're a fantastic organization to work with. They were totally open to us ignoring their official identity and designing something that had really its own file notes character, something that was very much its own set of publications outside of any official sort of marketing printed matter. But there was a definite demand that we had to have the logo, Camden Art Center, we had to have the address, the URL, sometimes a map. And we decided there was so much printed matter already with all of these information on there, rather than placing it ourselves as part of this very different design, we would simply take the opportunity each time to scan a different composition of ready-made letterheads, receipts from the store, publicity booklets. And so this changed each time. Every time we design, we have to scan a new composition with making sure we at least have the address and the logo in place. You can see another example there. Something else we really consciously did as a design decision was to propose to Camden that they give each booklet an ISBN number. And for us, that was a very conscious design decision, the idea that rather than seeing these as humble booklets in lieu of a nice coffee table book, by giving them an ISBN number, they would recognize the value of each publication having a specially commissioned essay, which they do. They're often fantastic bits of writing, and often they're the only publication existing on a particularly young artist. This is the first catalogue in quotation marks. But by giving an ISBN number, thereby making it, forcing it to be catalogued in the British Library collection, it sort of gave it this extra value, exceeding the very humble, saddle-stitched, uncoated paper stock. And another way of exceeding the value was, again, at the end of the year, you can collect them into annual collections, all the colored tabs. We made custom screen-printed ring binders, and the overall approach is one where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The idea that if you wanted, at the end, just in one take, to print a catalogue with 5 or 6 different paper stocks, 10 Pantone colors, CMYK, it would be impossible to do that. But because we're incrementally printing very small editions over the course of a year, you can actually build this very rich collection. The PVC folders themselves are simple off-the-shelf ones, so meaning that readers can pick whichever color they like for each year and gradually build a library. This brings me on to one of the final stages before I get on to just finishing up with my MCA projects. My other main client, apart from Camden Art Center, stretching back even further than 2004 to 2003, is Tate. Working mostly with Tate Modern and Tate Britain, also on occasion with Tate St Ives down in the southwest coast of the UK. I was very fortunate early on in running my studio to one of my earliest clients, who was a publisher. I lost touch with him for a year or so and then received a phone call one day with him announcing that he'd become the director of communications at the Tate, and would I fancy doing some work for them? And I immediately said yes, of course, and started straight away in 2003 working on various types of media and projects for the Tate. I mean, this particular one, Dominique Gonzalez Förster, one of the turbine hall projects at Tate Modern. It's probably the best example of the kind of thing I would usually do for a given exhibition. Often direct collaboration, again, with the artist. Signage, reflective signage placed directly into the turbine hall space as a form of fictitious introduction to Dominique's post-apocalyptic installation of artworks being stored away from the rain in 2058, 50 years on from the 2008 date of the actual exhibition. The poster was common with any turbine hall project poster, where we would have to publicize the exhibition without giving away the secret of what the actual installation would be. It's always very much a hyped story with the media and with the Tate. It's at a particular time of year when Frieze Art Fair is in town. There's always great anticipation of what this year's turbine hall project is going to be. The artist is announced very early on, but no one knows what the project is going to be. And we have this challenge as graphic designers to somehow publicize this event without showing people what it is. And we'll come up with various solutions. This was in direct discussion with Dominique, where we discovered we were both huge fans of the sort of futuristic illustrator artist Sid Mead, who is probably best known for designing the sets for Blade Runner. He designed the bikes, the light bikes in Tron, in the original Tron, for example. And we were kind of talking about this, that kind of thing. It would be great if we could get someone like that to do that sort of illustration. And I actually spent several weeks trying to find illustrators in London who could do this sort of retro futurist painting style before it dawned on me that I was working for the Tate, I could just call Sid Mead up in LA and he'd probably agree to do it, which was exactly the case. I mean, ultimately there was not enough time for him to paint a commissioned work, but he had this piece from, I believe it was from a US steel catalog in the 60s, which somehow resembled a possible post-apocalyptic turbine hall where perhaps it's turned into a motorway bypass with the constant rain of a London winter. And he agreed. I mean, Sid Mead's eventual only concern was that all of his fans would be disappointed coming to the Tate thinking they were going to see a Sid Mead show and ended up seeing this woman, Dominique Gonzalez-Foerster, who he didn't think many people might have heard of. So that was a really good outcome for that, at least. And this particular project also illustrates one of my common approaches with almost all of my work for the Tate, which was ways of dealing with what is quite a strict identity system, a so-called branding system, as Wolf Olins, the designer of the Tate identity and logo, calls it. They call it branding. That could be another whole lecture, my resistance to using the word branding when I talk about identities, particularly for cultural institutions. But I'll spare you all that this evening. But anyway, working for the Tate, you have an official color palette that you should use. You have an official typeface handed out on a CD-ROM to any designer working with the Tate. As you're all probably familiar with, being graphic designers working for any large organization or corporation, you have to adhere to the brand guidelines. I would try and subtly, I wouldn't say break the rules, but sort of negotiate the rules by working on custom typefaces, which were heavily based on using the constraints of the Tate typeface, but very strongly related to the content of the show and the work of the artist. So Tate 2058 immediately gave me the logic for Dominique's show, Turbine Hall 2058, the title of her show, this idea of what would the Tate be like in 50 years' time. That immediately gave me the chance to speculate what would the Tate typeface be in 50 years' time, and I predicted a return to geometry as opposed to the more humanist forms that the current Tate typeface has. So we had Tate 2058, regular and bold, which I used on all the material. This was the catalog, the front and back cover. We're also very happy to play with, again, in a similar way to Camden, often the first most obvious ideas that pop into your head are ideas that I'm quite happy to run with. So being a book about the future, I was happy to use fluorescent colors, holographic foil block on the back cover, all these kind of graphic future-related tropes that can be tacky, but if used in the right way, it kind of can work quite effectively. To show you some spreads from that catalog. This was the very first project designed for the Tate, again, taking this very approach I've described of somehow subverting the official font. I mean, this was for Tate Britain in 2003. I was given the project of designing the exhibition for Wolfgang Tillmans. I decided to illustrate Tillmans' very ad hoc bricolage approach to exhibitions where he doesn't frame any of his photographs but simply tapes them up on the wall, totally improvised at a couple of days before the exhibition opens. And for me, the stencil, the kind of temporary nature of the stencil illustrated this approach in a very subtle manner. So I cut up the Tate font into a stencil. I used a processed magenta, which was not an official color in the color palette. And I placed the logo on top of a photograph, which you were not allowed to do. And so I went very nervously into my first meeting with the director of Tate Britain and with the curators for the exhibition, almost afraid to show my approach, just as I was worried it would get shot down immediately. But as it turned out, we spent an hour discussing the line divider between Tillman's name and the title of the show, and no one mentioned the stencil or the color. Just a couple of other projects for Tate showing not only the print-based versions, but more multimedia aspects, which relate very strongly to the kind of work we're starting to initiate at the MCA now. This was quite an early project in terms of video podcasting, 2007. A new video program called Tate Shots, initiated by the Tate, where they release 6 different 5-minute documentaries, or shots as they call them, each month, which you can subscribe to as a podcast or download to your mobile device or watch online. Very early on, they included the embed code for people to embed them into their blogs or to post them on YouTube. So quite a prescient video program for a major institution like the Tate. Again, I made a variation on the Tate typeface, Tate Mono, a monospaced version, which for me worked very well at a small scale on the screen. I designed motion graphic identity for the beginning of each video. This was in collaboration with LA-based graphic designer Mark Owens, who's been a long-standing friend and collaborator of mine. And the typeface has gone on to have other lives with other exhibitions of mine, like Time Zones, an exhibition about video art. This is the catalog for Time Zones. And also to the point where enough other designers working for the Tate were seeing this monospace version around the galleries and started asking the official Tate print and design department for a copy of it. And it's kind of somehow become an official font now at the Tate. It's one that they use even without my involvement, which I was quite pleased about, to go from being slightly subversive to actually having an officially accepted extra cut of their branding font. Another turbine hall approach and another typeface approach, very heavily driven by the content of the work, was for Oliver Eliasson for his famous sun turbine hall piece, The Weather Project, this huge yellow sun. I mean, it was a very simple installation, yellow light and precipitation, mist, sort of enveloping the space, creating this very murky atmosphere of yellow light. But again, it was a poster where we had to publicize this project without giving the game away. And my approach for this particular one was to actually, what I saw as a very literal diagram of what was going to take place. Yellow light and, in the form of a dot typeface, precipitation, the mist of the exhibition. So in hindsight, visiting the installation, certain members of the audience might realize they had been they'd had the whole secret project explained to them all along, but not something you would actually recognize until you actually saw the exhibition. Most of the typefaces, often for my other projects, but particularly for Tate, involve just really one-offs. My intention is for them only to be designed for that particular exhibition and to never be used again. But the Tate dot font has had a second life since 2006 and ongoing for the Scottish artist Nathan Coley, where I've been designing. He designs these, or rather produces these installations of outdoor signage with various provocative statements in various contexts around the world. This particular sign was on the Isle of Bute in Scotland. And the dot typeface happened to work perfectly for light bulb signage, the kind of old-fashioned style that you used to see on theatre signage. And so every now and then I'll get a phone call from Nathan to typeset another one of his signs to be placed in various parts of the world. Another dot Tate project, this is the last project I'll show before I run on to my MCA work. This was another kind of, in a similar way to the Tate Shots project, it was sort of a request from the Tate to have a logo for a particular project, in this case, the Untitled Gallery, on the lower floor of Tate Modern. And my question back to them when I was told of the title, that it was a gallery called Untitled, was why does it need a logo? If it's called Untitled, giving it a logo refutes the very name of the project. And so my approach was to redefine what a logo could be and reducing it to its bare elements. As I explained earlier, the idea of a logo being simply something that can differentiate one corporation or one space from another space. And so for me, the form of differentiation was the sign itself. It was one of these flip dot matrix signs, which you often used to see on airport signage. It makes this kind of flickering, fluttering sound when they move across. In the UK, you have these on buses, so I actually had to contact a bus signage company to get one of these signs made. And I had to learn how to program the sign software with destinations. Each artist had to be a different destination with a bus route number. And so it was kind of a difficult thing to subvert, but worked perfectly with the role of this gallery, which was to show younger artists for much shorter periods of time than the usual 3 to 4 month major exhibitions at the Tate. So for me, the idea of this sort of flexible, untitled sign that constantly was moving, that could be updated remotely every month, for me was the logo for the determining factor for this gallery, the way that people could recognize it as opposed to any other gallery with different kinds of signage at the Tate. So going from a bus sign to a gallery sign, this project has now had a kind of third removal from its original context in the form of various contributions to graphic design exhibitions. This was in the Free Library. The sign has also been featured in the Forms of Inquiry traveling exhibition, which traveled around Europe in the last couple of years. And here it's moved from providing bus route information to providing gallery information to now purely providing kinetic information. It's essentially now a useless sign, purely showing the different patterns that every single artist showing at the Untitled, I applied a different pattern as a sort of untitled way of representing different people. And so here, it's literally untitled patterns shown in a gallery context as a work itself rather than as signage talking about work. So this brings me on to a final quick survey of the current work we're doing right now with my design department at the MCA Chicago. This was probably one of my favorite posters across the many exhibitions I worked on at the Tate for Luc Tuymans, for the Belgian painter. And so it was very fitting that the very first project I was given to work on when I arrived at MCA was also Luc Tuymans towards the autumn last year in 2010, just after I arrived at the end of August. And this particular project shows a current approach we're taking. We're sort of in a very much influx interim stage with the MCA right now, where we're beginning to plan a new identity system, but at the same time we have a lot of exhibitions which need to be designed right now, with a legacy identity which consists of Scala Sands, a very beautifully drawn typeface, but not particularly one that I would use myself necessarily. And so we're using exhibition identities as almost as a form of beta testing for different approaches that we might ultimately take with the new identity. And one consistent approach is what we're referring to, more or less, for want of a better term, as super graphics. The idea that rather than having very small, tasteful signage, which almost paradoxically, in my mind, becomes a distraction for a lot of visitors in these kind of institutions. If you see very small signage, you have to walk over and look closely at the wall before you go and see the artwork. For me, that's a distraction rather than large-scale signage where it's almost too obvious so the visitor can just glance at it and know exactly the direction they're going in. So it's a kind of form of identity, exhibition identity as wayfinding. So Luc Tuymans, we tried this approach. Rather than it necessarily feeling oversized, it's more just in relation to the scale of the building itself in the MCA. We have these large atrium spaces. This is on the main floor, current exhibition Without You I'm Nothing, where our senior designer, Scott, who's here with me on my trip to Minneapolis, we're using the chance here to have a research trip to the Walker as well to see how things work here. But this was Scott's idea to use, not only scale up the typography in proportion to the space, but to use the space, Without You I'm Nothing being a perfect title to play with various sides of the building. We have Without You on one side and I'm Nothing on the other. And we're finding very nice situations where visitors are photographing themselves against the I'm Nothing wall or against the Without You wall. A couple of other approaches. This is an exhibition of the Turner Prize winning artist, Scottish artist Susan Phillips, who just opened a couple of weeks ago. And some more longer-term, ongoing, recurring exhibitions based on the MCA's collection. This is a new strand organized by the new chief curator, Michael Darling, called MCA DNA, the kinds of collection works which really speak of the MCA's history, sort of fundamental DNA-like works in the MCA's collection. So this is a very simple system where we can simply change out the artist name and keep the MCA DNA typography going. Another major exhibition where we've been able to test these approaches across a wide range of media has been Jim Nutt, Chicago painter, known for his much more pop sort of driven work from the 60s, example of which you can see in the top left there, but also more recently in the last 10 or 15 years, focusing on one particular motif of an imaginary woman, which he obsessively paints in various forms, more related to Renaissance, Italian Renaissance painting. So for this exhibition, we used the Prismaset font in its more final form with almost a literal translation of the title coming into character. Each letter is a different character of the font. The geometry of the typeface happened to relate very nicely with the work you can see in the middle, for example. These are often very intricate geometric frames. And the color palette itself, I took, again, this approach that I've shown you previously of relinquishing the choice of color to someone else. And in this case, Jim Nutt being a very amazing colorist, apart from his painting work, we allowed him to dictate the color palettes based on his frames and pictures. So we have this, ultimately, what is a very strange color palette in a way, beige, pink, bright yellow, gray, blue. Not colors that I would ever pick myself at all, but actually very nice to work with. We also have a companion show at the moment, a kind of positive negative called Seeing as a Kind of Thinking, featuring artists like Mike Kelly, Irvin Fahlstrom, Thomas Apts, Chris Ware, and Rashid Johnson, wide range of artists who all surprisingly have, in one way or another, have been influenced by Jim Nutt's work. We've also been animating the logo for the various video content films we've been making for the MCA website and for viewing on mobile devices. A little outro for that one. And I'll finish up just with another very, very small project at the MCA, which took place in February this year, but one that for me is equally important as all the design work I'm doing with my team. And that is a very basic workshop I did for the Color Me in Space themed Family Day, which took place. We have family days once a month on Saturdays at the MCA, often inviting the education department running them very successfully, often inviting local Chicago artists to make site-specific workshops around the gallery to involve visiting children during the Saturday. I decided to make a moire workshop, a particular fascination of mine. Very, very basic, just the transparencies printed with various dot, line, the kind of patterns you saw in the Dear Lulu book, and just simply allowing, having these on transparency with a light box and allowing the children to experiment and play with the various optical illusions and forms that are made when you run different patterns on top of each other, along with a little bit of color theory, mixing different color transparencies together. You can see how it worked in the main atrium here. And so this for me is really, given my experience with the Werkplaats and with teaching in general as part of my practice, it's kind of comforting to me in a way that in spite of having moved from studio practice to academic practice and now to working within a museum institution, in a lot of ways, in spite of those changes in geography and in circumstance, I still feel like I'm actually doing the very same kind of work that I've always done, always involving research, analysis, certain forms of education, very much obvious graphic design, print and screen work as well. And the fact that I can continue that kind of work very naturally at the MCA has been a great comfort to me. So I'll leave you all with another vaguely color-related project, which was produced, again, it sort of mirrors my very first project of the color passport photo test pattern, of the test photographs, where, again, it's an open-ended project based on color. In this particular case, it's the Adobe Photoshop color palette, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And just based on a question I once asked myself, what would happen if you stripped the function away from the color palette and rendered it purely as a film, as a kind of test pattern? And so for the exhibition, the Free Library in New York several years ago, that's what I did. I was lucky enough to be given a 5-inch LED screen, and made very meticulous. It was a total nightmare to make. I had to make screenshots of every single step of every single color palette in Photoshop, over 2,000 frames, resulting in an ostensibly quite useless series of illusory test patterns. But it's a kind of point that I quite like making with a lot of my work. Often there's a definite function to the work, but I very much like the idea of graphic design having the capacity for inquiry or speculation or even fiction. And for me, I often find myself referring to Charles Eames and some discussions he made on the idea of whether design should be useful or not. He was once posed this very question and had the perfect response of, the purpose of design is not so much about use, but about needs, and the fact that the needs might be very subtle. They could be about simply making a user to laugh or to cause delight. And he summed it up perfectly with the point of who would say that pleasure is not useful. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, I don't know if we've got time. I'm afraid I did exactly what I promised not to do and digressed too much. But
we can take a couple of questions, and then we're having a reception following, too.
James, hello? Is it? Oh, yeah. There we go. Collaboration seems to be a through line through all of your work, either with other designers, but also with your clients. And I'm kind of curious what you look for in your collaborators, what kind of characteristics they exhibit, and what kind of traits you may try to find in them.
It's often not so much about finding them, but recognizing them in. I mean, that's one of the nice things. One of the things I've often really liked about graphic design is the fact that you're not necessarily choosing your clients. It's often, at least in my case, it's always been by chance. I haven't most of the time, apart from people like Bookworks, I haven't actively sought out commissions. If I've just been lucky enough to stumble into them, and so I'm often constantly surprised that I'll receive a random phone call from someone I would never expect, and the next day find myself spending the whole day investigating spectrograms or various things that I had never thought about before. And so often it's always trying to, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of trying to resist this division between them being the client and you being the designer, but more recognizing the scope for just having really interesting conversations and mutually learning things. And that's what I've always loved about graphic design, the idea that I can just be randomly placed with someone who is always very interesting and has their own particular obsessions. And part of what I'm doing part of my role as a designer is to really try and understand as much as possible about what their content is, what their approach, what their intention is with the project. And the best way to do that is just to engage them in discussion and to ask questions, and somehow it's only something I actually recognized very recently, that it was a form of collaboration. It was just, for me, through asking all of these questions, you would have very good discussions, and often end up having, with a lot of my clients, I would have a meeting about a particular topic. We'd spend hours talking and realize we hadn't actually addressed the original topic that we'd planned to meet about. And so I think it's more just recognizing the inherent possibility for collaboration rather than actively seeking it out or trying to drive it in a particular direction yourself.
On some of your projects, you often spoke about running with one of the first ideas that you had when you felt that it was most appropriate. And I think in design education, they often stress the necessity of generating hundreds of ideas and variations. So I'm curious how you negotiate the balance of gut instinct and the arduous nature of the ideation process.
This is a new term I've just been discovering since I've moved to America, the ideation, which I guess what's traditionally called as brainstorming. But I think it's often very, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I often will contradict various approaches. Some projects I will have that first idea, and I'm not afraid of the obvious. So a lot of my work, I'm often dealing with the obvious. I'll pick colors according to the season, or often what seems obvious once it ends up in the final project isn't immediately obvious to the reader or to the audience. Other times I will, because of my desire to actively engage the client, I will involve them in the decision making, and I often won't be sure of my particular approach. And maybe one approach that I think is perfect is making certain assumptions or presumptions about the client, which they can safely refute because they know more about the project. And so it's always judging that, really. I don't really have one approach. At the Tate, I became known for showing up with just one poster each time and not giving them any choice. But I would always secretly have a backup in my bag just in case things were going really badly. But for me, it always comes down to judging the particular context, the particular client, the nature of the content you're dealing with, what kind of context the work is going to be viewed in or operating in. And that ends up determining whether there's one immediate, perfect, unquestionable solution, or whether some investigation and experimentation needs to take place, requiring several solutions which need the assistance of the client in selecting.
Well, we're going to have a reception following in the cafe, and James will be out there as well. So you can ask him privately.